A new hockey season is underway, and nearly 5 months after the Stanley Cup riot in Vancouver, police there are now recommending 163 charges against 60 people, and they hope to charge 700 more. Jason, why the delay in recommending the charges? Tell us more about the massive amount of evidence and the technology being used to comb through it.
Well, I don't know if it's because we're talking about hockey, but this has kind of summoned my inner Don Cherry because I'm really riled up about this. The Vancouver police just took a beating about how long it's taken to lay charges, but the sheer size and scope of this investigation is just mind-boggling when you think about it. We're talking about 5,000 hours of video footage that investigators and analysts have had to go through. That compares to about 100 hours of, I think, VHS tape that they went through in the '94 riots. Now, they're using facial recognition technology that has allowed them, from what I understand, to identify 15,000 separate criminal acts. And what it's also allowed them to do is to take suspects and track them through different locations where the rioting was occurring. Now, you want to talk about why it's taken so long. You've alluded to the sheer scale of evidence, and that's certainly it. But another thing is it just seems like they want to be doing this right. You only have one chance when you go to court, and the police chief, Jim Chu, actually had a really good example of why things are taking so long. They had someone who came forward not too long after the riots, fairly early on in the investigation, and copped a damaging a vehicle that had been parked on the streets. Now, had they pulled the trigger on charges... Pardon me?
Admitted to that, but then they caught him on
he admits to that. They could have pulled the charges, trigger on the charges there, but instead, using the technology that they have, they were able to actually go through a long sequence of events, find the same individual allegedly at several other points along the way, committing several other criminal acts, and now he's facing a raft of charges.
So then the question becomes, Rod, will the evidence that police are putting forward to the Crown, will the Crown go ahead and press the charges? Do you see any problems with the detective work?
Well, there are different levels of proof that are required. So the police need reasonable and probable grounds to potentially lay a charge. The Crown prosecutors have to ask themselves, is there a reasonable likelihood of conviction? So the Vancouver police and the RCMP aren't going to go through all of this work unless they can connect all of the dots and they can satisfy the prosecutors that there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. So they're not going to send half-finished files to the Crown prosecutors.
And isn't a picture or a video of someone committing a crime pretty good proof?
Well, it's good proof, but you have to identify the person. There may be eyewitness evidence. They've used DNA. So it's a very, as Jason said, a very time-consuming process.
Keith, after the G20 riots in Toronto, scores of people were released without charges. Now, we know many of them may not have been doing anything to be arrested, but there were people breaking windows, setting cars on fire, tipping over police cars. Would Albertans inclined to set fire to a car, commit vandalism during an Oilers or Flames celebration be less likely to do so if they have a look at what Vancouver's doing?
Do you mean, are we going to riot if we finish 30th again? Probably. But I really think the Vancouver police are on the right track here. And I was in Vancouver centuries ago for the Grey Cup riot. It was the last Grey Cup ever played on a Saturday. They moved the game to Sundays because they thought booze is what caused it. But I think, and I don't think 5 months is an extraordinarily long period of time either. I think the new technologies, the work that has to go in this, in order to be successful, the worst thing would be not to be successful in pursuing these. So 3 cheers for Vancouver police. I think the criticism is misplaced, and I really think they are trying to line all their ducks up and be successful.
They've really taken a mountain of social media evidence and been able to find a way to work with it. And just before we go, Jason, should Alberta police be getting this in line? Vancouver obviously had a scramble. It cost them $300,000. Should Alberta police maybe be at least looking at how to be ready before the trouble for next time? Should there be a next
They'd be remiss if they weren't always looking for best practices elsewhere. But if there's one area where the Vancouver police maybe are in for some criticism, and we've seen it, it's for allowing the conditions of the riot to take place and then the response to the unrest as it started to snowball. So really, I think before anything like that happens in Alberta, our police would probably be taking a look at just whether large gatherings like that would be allowed to take place and how they would respond. That's probably step A. Step B, certainly looking at how they'd review their evidence or what kind of evidence they'd need would certainly be something they're looking at right now. But I think that they would start with probably wanting to prevent something like this from ever happening here.
Next up, long gun owners will no longer be required to register their weapons, but the federal government is even scrapping the existing database. Is that wise? And how will Alberta fight guns instead? Alberta Primetime returns in a moment. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime in the Wednesday Crime Panel. The federal government is poised to scrap Canada's $2 billion long gun registry. Tories see it as government gone crazy, a costly program that didn't stop crime. Keith, what do you think?
Well, I think there's so many dimensions to this. But the bottom line is, did it work? Did it actually stop any murders, any crimes?
But how would we know that if it stopped them?
Well, I don't think we really do know that, except that the number of crimes or murders who are committed by people with long guns is probably pretty minuscule. Then there's all the philosophical stuff about, do we need to register everything? Is that an infringement in our rights?
Right.
All of those sorts of things come together here. But bottom line for me is $2 billion. We could build a lot of arenas and museums with that kind of money.
Educate a lot of kids not to join gangs.
Oh, maybe.
Rod, step one, kill even the database so that this thing can never be resurrected again. We did pay $2 billion for it. Do we even just want to throw all that information away?
Well, we're not throwing it away because every gun owner has to get a gun license. So you are registered as a gun owner. You've got to take a course. You've got to renew your registration.
So it was redundant.
And so if they're getting rid of it, they should get rid of it. You still have to register restricted weapons. And I was in court last week in a rural location for a person who was charged with possessing unregistered long guns. The prosecutor allowed him to get his guns back if he got a license and if the guns were going to be properly registered. And so at the end of the day, he got a criminal record for that. His guns weren't registered, the long guns. And so the judge said, well, I'll make the order if there's still a gun registry. Oh. And I said, well, I'm not going to hold my breath because I've heard it for so long, and now they're saying that they're actually going to do it. So I guess when it comes time, he may not have to actually register the guns, and he now has a criminal record. So I think philosophically, if you have a firearms license and you register your restricted weapons, do you really need to register long guns? I'm not sure you do.
Jason, no provinces except perhaps Quebec seem interested in starting up provincial registries of their own. Is Alberta perhaps doing other things to fight crimes? Perhaps a story in your own paper, listening to one of only a handful of Canadian environmental criminologists talking about urban planning. That's the way to stop crime.
That's certainly one way. There is really no appetite, I think, for a provincial registry here in Alberta. That's probably an obvious statement. Certainly here in Calgary, for a long time, our police chief, Rick Hansen, broke ranks with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, which had historically supported the long gun registry, to say that it's just ineffectual because criminals don't register guns. It's been the suspicion for a long time that a lot of police chiefs probably privately hold that view, but maybe supported the gun registry publicly because the federal government holds some purse strings when it comes to funding law enforcement. Environmental design certainly is one way, and it's crime prevention. And what we always talk about is how crime prevention is a tough sell because you can't quantify how many crimes may have been avoided by doing something. But it's a concept that is gaining traction. The Calgary Police actually have a coordinator that works with developers, business, community associations, downtown business groups to take a look at properties to remove obstacles, barriers that may give criminals a hiding place or may allow people to break into premises without being observed. And it's probably got a really good value in the long term. Our Riverwalk here in Calgary in what used to be a no-go zone in the East Village has been completely redesigned, and it's not only very aesthetically pleasing, but you'll see little touches where they have these promenades that are overlooking the river, and underneath they're lit up with these LEDs. Now, it's very pretty at night, but it's also to light up the area underneath the promenade where people used to gather and smoke crack.
The one person in Calgary that Jason and I are talking about, Nikki Filipuzzi at Calgary's Mount Royal University, saying we can plan and build for less crime. Keith, does that work? What kind of places do we want? What don't we want?
I think this isn't a new concept, and whether you're talking about peepholes in doors or
front porches
or lit up streets or cul-de-sacs so that people can't kind of drive through, architects and designers have been taking this into account, and I think take it more into account as time goes. And we know that if you can increase density of population, you can affect crime rates. One of my favorite stories in Edmonton here is the beautiful Amiskwaskahegan Park on Jasper Avenue and 105th Street was originally designed with hills and valleys and trees.
Yeah.
And
what happened behind them?
People just loved that thing, but the police stood there and looked at it and said, "Oh my God!" And sure enough, it was a hangout for prostitutes and drug dealers and everything.
Flat.
And now it is flat. And there's an example of having to take into account, unfortunately, the realities that design can invite or inhibit crime.
Rod, just changing gears a little bit before we close out tonight, people living with HIV who don't let their partners know of their disease are being charged with aggravated assault. A few high-profile cases before Alberta's courts. AIDS Calgary, a group that has appeared on this program on this very issue, says that charge, aggravated sexual assault, is far too harsh and it stigmatizes the people being charged. If you're the victim, maybe you don't think so. Where does the law take this?
I agree with the Calgary lawyers who have spoken out against this, and I think they're pigeonholing that set of circumstances into a crime where it doesn't really fit. Aggravated assault is wound, maim, disfigure, or endanger the person's life. If they want to legislate it, and I'm not sure they should, they could have
separate
as an aggravating circumstance in sentencing the fact that the person had a sexually transmitted disease when they committed the act knowing they did. It could just be listed as an aggravating circumstance in sentencing. I don't think it's an aggravated sexual assault. It might be a sexual assault, and the aggravating factor is this person had HIV when they knowingly put the other person in risk.
You're nodding your head. Keith, what do you think?
Well, I really do agree. I think that we're talking about almost impolite behavior here.
Really? With a life-threatening disease?
Well, and one of the realities is that these are all multiple partner offenses, the ones that have been pursued here. And I think there's a responsibility that lies maybe on both sides, whether you're the giver or the receiver.
You can demand protection.
Yeah, and the idea of responsibility has long been lost in the rhetoric of victim and all of this sort of stuff, the terms we use here.
We're out of time for this evening. I could ask you guys questions all night. Fascinating to listen to all of you. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Glad to be here.
Keith Spencer is a retired University of Alberta criminologist and former assistant warden of the Edmonton Correctional Institution. Rod Gregory, defense trial lawyer with Davidson Gregory Daniluk. And from the Calgary Herald tonight, crime reporter Jason Van Rassel.